Hi everyone. I've spent the last few years working on this film along with a really great and dedicated crew. At its core, the film is about a network of people who help Western patients to buy life-saving hepatitis C drugs from India. They do this because these drugs can cost as much as $84,000 in some Western countries. In India, where I'm from, generic versions of these drugs are available for less than $900. Now this network, the Buyers Club if you like, functions on trust and solidarity alone because many of the people involved have never even met each other except online. It's a tale of survival against great odds, and it also addresses what I think is one of the most important healthcare issues of our times, the rising cost of medicines. As a society, we've become dangerously complacent about rising drug prices and have unquestioningly accepted a narrative that the medicines that cure us are expensive because the companies that make them invest billions of dollars in research and development and must necessarily be rewarded for their innovation. I find that line of thinking highly problematic. The film will tackle why, and it will also address that very thin line between profiting and profiteering. It all began a few years ago when I first heard about Greg Jeffries, an Australian man in his 60s who had become the first Western patient to travel to India and successfully cure himself of hepatitis C with the generic drugs. I knew then that thousands and thousands of patients were waiting in the wings, watching his experience very closely, trying to see if they could do the same for themselves. Greg and I began to have these really long cross-continental conversations, and I was really impressed by his conviction and his resolve to help others, and also by his belief that something was fundamentally wrong with the system of pricing medicines. By the time we began filming, he had already set up a functional global buyers club from his living room in the tiny island of Tasmania, which was very impressive. He was helping thousands of patients already to source these drugs from India. And it was fascinating to watch him just work his way through the logistic hurdles. For example, very quickly in the process, he figured out that there are some countries where you just cannot deliver this drug by post. It gets seized by customs. So he did the next best thing. He found volunteers in neighboring countries, and he would just ship these drugs to the volunteers, and the patients would just travel to a nearby country and pick up the drugs for themselves. So every time he ran into a problem, he found a solution. So he had essentially created a network built on nothing but trust and solidarity, and it made me realize that when faced with unjust practices, people will always step up to help other people. I remember Greg telling me once that what he was doing was not very different from smuggling narcotics, except the end result was that instead of destroying lives, he was saving them. And he was doing all of this in a legal way. Once we were done filming with Greg in Tasmania, things moved very quickly. We found ourselves filming with a patient in Sweden who'd sourced these drugs from Greg. We filmed in Romania, which has the highest burden of hepatitis C in Europe. We attended an ostentatious pharmaceutical conference in Paris, attended by the who's who of big pharma. And of course, we filmed with Greg's supplier and networks in Mumbai. To really do justice to this story, we need to film in the United States, where these drugs were first launched and where the pricing policies stem from. I want to interview big pharma representatives. We want to speak to congressmen and senators who've investigated the rising prices of medicines. And indeed, we want to speak to the pharmaceutical companies themselves. I'm essentially trying to raise $42,000. That's what I need to complete this project. And just to put that in perspective, $42,000 is just half the cost of one treatment for one hepatitis C patient in many Western countries. I'm confident that we can raise that much. So please support us in any way that you can. We would be very grateful for the smallest donation or even just a shout out on social media. But we will need some large donors to help us get to America to ask difficult questions to the people in power. So please support us in any way that you can and help us to change the system together.